Since the operation of an airbag system can mean the difference between life and death, it's critical that it functions properly. So when the customer complaint is related to the airbag system, you must be able to diagnose and repair the airbag system properly. Hello and welcome. In this program, we're going to provide you with diagnostic and service information for MMC airbag systems. We'll connect the scan tool and check for diagnostic trouble codes. We'll go through some diagnostics using the service manual procedures and the multimeter. We'll show you why some airbag system diagnostic trouble codes are unnecessarily being set and what to do about it. And we'll be replacing the components that are required when a vehicle is in a collision in which the airbag is deployed. We won't be going into airbag system basics, so if you need information on the basics, see the November 1993 issue of MasterTech, which covers 1994 passive restraint systems. There's two types of airbag systems currently used on MMC vehicles. The first type is a 3-sensor impact detection system used in the 1994 Stealth, 1995 Talon, Avenger, and Sebring. It has 2 impact sensors in the front corners of the vehicle and a safing sensor in the SRS Diagnostic unit. All of these vehicles have dual airbags. The second type is a 2-sensor impact detection system used in the 1994 Colt, Summit, Summit Wagon, and Colt Vista. It uses an analog G sensor and safing G sensor, both located inside the SRS Diagnostic unit. These vehicles use only a driver's side airbag. The SRS Diagnostic unit is located under the rear of the center console on all of these vehicles. Before we get into diagnostics, let's try a review question to check your knowledge of system applications. Which car line uses a 2-sensor airbag system with both sensors located in the SRS Diagnostic unit? A. 1994 Stealth, B. 1995 Avenger and Sebring, C. 1994 Colt and Summit, or D. 1995 Talon? The answer is C. The 1994 Colt and Summit use a 2-sensor airbag system with both sensors located in the SRS Diagnostic unit. The service manual provides information for the supplemental restraint system in Section 23B. There is no separate diagnostic manual. Section 23B also includes diagnostic trouble codes and step-by-step diagnostic procedures which will help you in troubleshooting the system. Unless the vehicle has been in an accident, complaints about the airbag system will usually be due to the SRS warning light. Either it does not illuminate at all, it stays on for more than 7 seconds when the ignition is turned to the on or start position, or it illuminates while driving. If the warning light is not functioning properly, the first step is to check the 2 airbag system fuses. If the fuses are okay, turn the ignition on and verify the customer complaint. The next step is to check for diagnostic trouble codes with the scan tool. Always make sure the ignition is off before connecting the scan tool, as recommended by the service manual. There may be 1 or 2 data link connectors, depending on the vehicle. Data link connectors for 1994 and 1995 vehicles with airbags are located below the instrument panel above the accelerator pedal. 2 new MMC adapters are now available for hookup of the DRB2. The DRB3 also comes with 2 special MMC cables. A chart in the reference book provides information on the different data link connectors, adapters, and cables used in MMC vehicles. If you find any stored diagnostic trouble codes, record them on the repair order for future reference. This will help you if the condition is intermittent. You can find out how long a code has been stored by looking under Sensors. The next step is to erase the codes and wait at least 45 seconds. Then, recheck for diagnostic trouble codes. If a diagnostic trouble code is displayed, you'll need to check the reference chart in the service manual for the appropriate diagnostic procedure. If the diagnostic code does not return at this time, it may be an intermittent condition, or the condition is no longer present. Right after a review question, we'll discuss airbag service precautions. Then we'll get into some diagnostics. What is your first step when you have found a stored diagnostic trouble code during your initial check? A. Record it on the repair order. B. Erase it with a scan tool. C. Erase it, then recheck for trouble codes. Or D. Diagnose it using the service manual. The answer is A. The first step when finding a trouble code is to record it on the repair order. In order to avoid injury to yourself or others from accidental deployment of the airbags during servicing, there are certain precautions that must be followed. When diagnosing the airbag system, use only a scan tool or a digital multimeter. Never use an analog ohm meter or electrical test equipment like a self-powered test light, because they could cause the airbags to deploy. Always disconnect the battery negative cable and isolate it before working on system components. Then wait 2 minutes for the system capacitors to discharge. Front impact sensors, the SRS diagnostic unit, clock spring, and airbag modules are each serviced as an assembly. Do not attempt to repair any of these components. In addition, if a wiring harness connector is damaged, replace the appropriate wiring harness. Before baking the vehicle after painting, remove the front impact sensors, SRS diagnostic unit, airbag modules, and clock spring. And after servicing the system, check the warning light to make sure the system is functioning properly. Many of the diagnostic procedures require you to disconnect the SRS diagnostic unit. The SRS diagnostic unit has a double lock mechanism consisting of a primary lock on each connector and secondary lock that retains all the connectors. The secondary lock has a spring below the green lock lever. For vehicles built after June 1993, a V-slot has been added to the secondary lock lever to aid in making contact with the connector lock spring. An arrow has also been added on the lock lever to indicate the direction to push the lock spring. On older units, the release procedure is the same. However, there is no V-slot, making it a little harder to make contact with the lock spring. The service manual also mentions an SRS check harness, but this harness is not necessary. Instead of using this harness, you'll have to carefully probe the connectors themselves. Let's run through a diagnostic problem, following the procedure provided in the service manual. In this case, we find diagnostic code 11 on a Talon. This code indicates a short in the front impact sensor circuit, or in a circuit from the passenger and driver airbag squib to ground, or to the power supply. We start by turning the ignition key to the lock position. Then we disconnect and isolate the battery negative cable and wait 2 minutes before disconnecting any airbag components. Next, we remove the center console to attain access to the SRS diagnostic unit. We disengage the secondary lock of the unit and remove the large connector. With a digital multimeter, we check the resistance between terminals 15 and 18, the right front impact sensor circuit. If the resistance is approximately 2,000 ohms, the sensor circuit is okay. Next, we check the resistance between terminals 16 and 17, the left front impact sensor circuit. We find that the resistance is out of spec, so we know the condition is caused by a short in the wiring from the left front impact sensor, or the sensor itself. We'll start by checking the sensor. To check resistance at the left impact sensor, remove the splash shield in the left front wheel well. You'll see the sensor in the upper front corner of the fender. To disconnect the impact sensor connector, pull back on the green connector lock and lift up on the red locking tab. Then measure the resistance between the terminals of the sensor. It should be about 2,000 ohms. The resistance is not within the specs, so we'll replace the impact sensor on this vehicle. If the resistance is within specs, the wiring from the SRS diagnostic unit to the sensor should be checked for a short. All of these diagnostic steps are provided in the service manual. Another thing we'd like to discuss is a TSB that was just issued. TSB 232594 discusses SRS troubleshooting on the Dodge Stealth. This TSB was issued because SRS diagnostic units that are okay are being returned. Even though this TSB discusses Stealth, some of these diagnostic codes could occur on other MMC vehicles, and the reasons they occur are the same. The first part of the TSB refers to diagnostic codes 32, 41, and 42. Code 32 indicates the condenser voltage is too low in the SRS diagnostic unit. Codes 41 and 42 indicate that ignition voltage at the SRS diagnostic unit is less than 8 volts. Be aware that these codes could be triggered by low battery voltage. In fact, low battery voltage is a common cause. So, if one of these codes is displayed, you should start by checking battery voltage. If the battery is not fully charged, recharge it or replace it if necessary. When you have a fully charged battery, check the warning light. If the light is on, turn the ignition key on and off 10 times and check the light again. If the light is still on, erase any diagnostic codes with the scan tool. Wait 45 seconds and check the light again. If the light is on, follow the procedure for the diagnostic trouble code displayed on the scan tool and correct the condition. You might see other diagnostic codes while working on the airbag system. These include codes 12 and 13, an open impact sensor circuit, code 22, an open circuit from the driver's airbag module, code 34, an open secondary lock on the SRS diagnostic unit, or code 43, open SRS warning light circuits. What do these codes have in common? They all could be caused by disconnected wiring connectors. If you see these diagnostic codes, start by verifying that all wiring connectors are connected. Be sure the SRS diagnostic unit secondary lock is properly connected. Then use the scan tool to erase the diagnostic trouble codes. Believe it or not, SRS diagnostic units are being replaced because diagnostic trouble codes are present, when these codes could simply be erased. If you erase the diagnostic trouble codes and the SRS warning light still does not go out, follow the procedures described earlier. The final issue in the TSB is diagnostic code 11, which is commonly caused by a short in the front impact sensor circuit. We went through the diagnostic procedure for code 11 earlier, but the TSB provides an added step. If you find the diagnostic code 11 is being activated intermittently on the Stealth, check each impact sensor by leaving the multimeter connected for 60 seconds. If the resistance goes outside of the 2,000 plus or minus 40 ohms range specified for the Stealth, replace the sensor. When you inspect impact sensors on 1991 and 1992 Stealths, look for signs of corrosion on the terminals. Moisture entering through the terminal cavity could be the cause. Impact sensors on vehicles built after June 1992 are sealed with resin to eliminate the possibility of moisture entry. Before we move on, we'd like to check your knowledge of diagnostic trouble codes with a review question. If you receive diagnostic code 41 or 42 while diagnosing the airbag system, what is your first step? A, replace the fuse. B, check the battery voltage. C, check for open connectors. D, erase the diagnostic trouble codes. The answer is B. Be sure the battery is fully charged. Codes 41 or 42 could be caused by low battery voltage. The airbag system should always be checked after a collision, whether or not the airbags have deployed. You should check and record all diagnostic trouble codes and erase them and wait at least 45 seconds. Recheck and record all displayed diagnostic codes and perform the diagnostic procedures required. If the vehicle was in a low-speed or non-frontal collision in which the airbags did not deploy, check all components for damage and replace them if necessary. Check front impact sensors and their mounting surface for damage or corrosion. And check for wiring harness and connector damage. Examine the SRS diagnostic unit and check the connectors and the lock lever for damage. Inspect airbag modules for damage. Examine the clock spring connectors and protective tube for damage. And check the clock spring case and gears for damage. If there was a collision in which the airbags did deploy, replace all of the components listed in the service manual and replace the wiring harness if it was damaged. Before servicing any airbag components, remove and isolate the battery negative cable. You'll also have to clean up any powder that was expelled from the airbags during deployment. Be sure to wear a long-sleeve shirt, safety goggles, and rubber gloves during the cleanup. Front impact sensors are accessed by removing the front wheel splash shield on the Talon, Avenger, Sebring, and Stealth. Release the green connector lock and disconnect the impact sensor connector. Then remove the impact sensor from the vehicle. Be sure to inspect the upper frame for rust or damage to make sure that the new sensor will mount correctly. Always check the resistance of the new impact sensor before installing it. If it is within specs, check that the arrow on top of the sensor is pointing toward the front of the vehicle. And install the sensor. Be sure to fasten the bolts securely. Finally, connect the connector, making sure to engage the green connector lock. The next component to be replaced is the SRS diagnostic unit. Remove the center console according to the procedures provided in Section 23B of the service manual. Place a flat blade screwdriver against the lock spring at the lock lever notch and push the spring toward the unit. Remove each harness connector by pushing its lock downward. Remove the 4 screws that hold the SRS diagnostic unit to the bracket and remove it. Install a new diagnostic unit and replace the fasteners. Connect each harness connector securely and in its proper location. Then press down on the secondary lock lever until it locks in place. The passenger airbag can be removed next. Open the glove compartment and remove the 2 bolts and the 2 screws that fasten the airbag module to the instrument panel and disconnect the connector. The airbag can then be pushed up from the inside and lifted out of the opening in the instrument panel. Inspect the area around the instrument panel opening for cracks or damage that could require instrument panel replacement. Install the new passenger airbag by reversing the steps, being careful not to damage the instrument panel trim. The next step is to remove and replace the driver airbag, clock spring, steering column, and intermediate shaft. Start by removing the 4 bolts that hold the driver airbag in place. Lift the airbag from the steering wheel and disconnect the airbag connector and the horn connector. Remove the ventilation ducts using the procedure provided in Section 24 of the service manual under ventilators. Remove the steering wheel retaining nut from the steering shaft. Then use a steering wheel puller to remove the steering wheel. Remove the 4 screws that hold the upper and lower column covers together, and remove both covers by disengaging the retainers that hold the covers together. Next, disconnect the 2 clock spring connectors at the end of the clock spring's wiring harness. The green tab on the red connector must be unlocked before disconnecting the red connector. Remove the 4 screws that hold the clock spring to the column switch assembly, and remove the clock spring. Next, remove the 3 screws that hold the column switch assembly in place. Disconnect the 3 connectors at the back of the assembly and remove the column switch assembly from the steering column. Disconnect the 2 ignition cylinder connectors. Remove all wiring retainers and separate the wiring harness from the steering column. If the vehicle has an automatic transaxle, you'll also have to remove the key interlock cover and key interlock cable. Remove the pinch bolt that holds the base of the steering shaft to the intermediate shaft. 6 bolts hold the steering column in place. First, remove the 4 bolts at the bottom of the steering column. Remove the brake pedal return spring. Then remove the 2 bolts at the top of the column. The steering column can now be removed from the vehicle. To remove the intermediate shaft, remove the pinch bolt that holds the bottom of the intermediate shaft to the steering gear. Then remove the 4 intermediate shaft to cowl panel retaining bolts and remove the intermediate shaft. Before you're ready to install the new components, you'll have to do 2 more things. To remove the steering lock cylinder from the steering column, you'll have to use a hacksaw to cut the special bolts through the steering lock bracket. Make your cut at the bracket, so when the pieces are removed, you can unscrew the remaining portion of the bolts from the steering lock cylinder. Use a new steering lock bracket and special bolts to install the steering lock cylinder onto the new steering column. After checking that the lock works properly, tighten the special bolts until the heads twist off. You'll also have to remove the boot and inner cover from the intermediate shaft. To do this, apply grease to the inside lip of the boot. Use a rod to widen the inside lip, slipping it over the joint. Use the same procedure to remove the inner cover and to replace both the inner cover and boot on the new intermediate shaft. Reverse the order of removal when installing the intermediate shaft and steering column. Slip the intermediate shaft into the steering gear by lining up the splines. Be sure the inner cover and retainer is installed with the larger circumference of the retainer facing down. Install and tighten the 4 retaining bolts to 48 inch-pounds. Then replace the pinch bolt that holds the shaft to the gearbox valve housing, tightening it to 156 inch-pounds. Install the new steering column and shaft assembly, lining up the splines of the intermediate shaft with the splines on the steering shaft. Install the 2 upper mounting bolts without tightening them. Then install and tighten the pinch bolt that holds the steering shaft to the intermediate joint, tightening it to 156 inch-pounds. Install the 4 lower steering column mounting bolts and tighten the upper and lower mounting bolts to 108 inch-pounds. If the vehicle has an automatic transaxle, you'll have to install the key interlock cover and key interlock cable and reattach the brake pedal return spring. Connect the 2 ignition cylinder connectors. Slide the column switch assembly onto the steering column and connect the 3 connectors. Fasten the column switch assembly to the steering column. Before installing the new clock spring, be sure the front wheels are in the straight ahead position. The new clock spring is pre-centered and taped in place, so the clock spring centering procedure is not necessary. Install the new clock spring by lining up the different size tabs on the inner part of the clock spring with the slots in the column switch assembly, and the screw holes in the clock spring with the holes in the column switch assembly. Tighten the 4 clock spring retaining screws, and don't forget to remove the tape. Now connect the clock spring connectors, making sure to snap the red connector's green locking tab in place. At this time, be sure that all wiring is secured to the steering column with the proper retainers. Then reinstall the upper and lower column covers. With the front wheels straight ahead, install the steering wheel over the steering column splines, making sure it is properly positioned. Turn the steering wheel all the way in both directions to be sure it moves freely. Install the steering wheel retaining nut and tighten it to 30 foot-pounds. Reconnect the horn connector and the airbag module connector. And mount the airbag module on the steering wheel, taking care not to pinch the wiring. Install the 4 attaching bolts and tighten them to 48 inch-pounds. After installing all components, reconnect the battery negative cable and turn the ignition on. Check that the SRS warning light illuminates for about 7 seconds and then goes off. Leave the ignition on for at least 45 seconds to make sure the light stays off. If the light stays on or comes back on, check for diagnostic codes and diagnose them using the service manual procedure. If the light stays on and there are no diagnostic codes present, cycle the key on and off 10 times. When the system checks out okay, replace the front wheel splash shields, the center console, and the ventilation ducts. Before we move on, I'd like to cover installation and centering of the original clock spring when it has been removed. Start by making sure the front wheels are in the straight-ahead position. Check that the mating mark and neutral position indicator on the clock spring are aligned. If the clock spring is turned 1 revolution to the right, the mating mark will be aligned with the R1 position indicator instead of neutral. If the clock spring's mating marks are not properly aligned, the steering wheel may not rotate completely, or the clock spring could be damaged, causing the SRS warning light to illuminate. Now connect the clock spring connector. Replace the steering column cover, steering wheel, and airbag. We've got one more review question before we bring this MasterTech to a close. Why do the front wheels need to be in the straight-ahead position? A, to install the clock spring properly. B, to install the steering wheel properly. C, both A and B. Or D, neither A nor B. The answer is C. The front wheels need to be straight so that the clock spring and the steering wheel can be installed properly. In this program, we looked at airbag diagnostic trouble codes, and we went through a diagnostic procedure using the steps in the service manual. Finally, we removed and replaced the components required after a collision, as outlined in the service manual. We've tried to give you what you need to understand MMC airbag systems. But if you want to know more, enroll in an airbag system course at Chrysler Technical Training. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next month.